All previous afterwards on our website .org.
Republican Senator Mike Lee from Utah is next on Book TV with his new book. He argues that portions of the U.S. Constitution are currently diminished, from the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizures to the Origination Clause, which states that all tax bills must originate in the House of Representatives.
My name is Matt Kibbe. I'm the president of FreedomWorks, and I am here with Senator Mike Lee from Utah, who has written a new book, an important book, Our Lost Constitution, the Willful Subversion of America's Founding Document. Thank you, Senator, for being with us.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I really enjoyed reading this book, and I wanted to start with a question about your interesting upbringing. You discussed the Constitution and the separation of powers when you were just a kid at the dinner table with your parents.
Yes, we did. And I think I was 30 years old before I realized not every family did that, but it was something that was common in our house. Common enough, in fact, that I didn't realize it was uncommon. So, my dad liked to talk about those issues, and I grew up with it. These were just regular, routine conversations in our house.
That was not my experience as a child. In your office, you described 2 stacks of papers in 2013, the legislation that was approved by Congress versus the regulations that were promulgated by the vast bureaucracy. Explain why that story is so important.
Yeah, so in my office, I've got 2 stacks of documents that I describe in the book. The first stack is 11 feet tall, and it contains 80,000 pages. The second stack is just a few inches tall, contains only a few hundred pages. Stack 1, the one that's 11 feet tall, consists of last year's Federal Register, the annual cumulative index of all the regulations as they're promulgated and released for notice and comment and then finalized by executive branch bureaucracies. These are laws. These are laws that are binding on the American people, and yet they're passed by men and women who were never elected. As well-intentioned, well-trained, specialized as they might be, they never stand for election. The other stack, the stack that's just a few inches tall, those are the laws passed by Congress last year. And they are passed by people who are elected, but there aren't very many of them. So this is a big problem. Congress has delegated its lawmaking power. It's delegated it to the point that most of our laws are now made by people who never stand for election.
And this gets to the question of delegation, and our Constitution was quite explicit that Congress had the authority to pass laws, and yet you have all these faceless, gray-suited bureaucrats making decisions. And you actually call out George W. Bush on campaign finance reform for willfully signing something that he said explicitly, I don't think this is constitutional. Why is this trend happening? Why are politicians and others delegating to people that haven't been elected?
Okay, so a couple of things. I mean, first of all, we've got the delegation problem, where the delegation problem that you asked about relates to the fact that there is a natural tendency among politicians to want somebody else to have to do the dirty work, to have to do the tough part, to actually engage in the difficult line drawing analysis. And so it's easier to just say we shall have good law regarding the environment, and we hereby delegate that task to the EPA. The EPA then has to make all those laws. Members of Congress don't stand accountable to it. As far as the question about punting on constitutional questions, deferring to the courts, that's more a function of the fact that culturally, for whatever reason, especially in Washington, we have gotten to an unfortunate point where questions about the constitutionality of a bill pending before Congress tend to be conflated with the question of, is the court likely to invalidate this? And if the answer to that question is no, then people assume that it's constitutional. That's not always the case. And you can't just assume that whether or not the court is willing to invalidate it will itself determine the constitutionality. Every member of Congress is himself or herself obligated under an oath, required under Article 6 of the Constitution, to protect the Constitution and to engage in meaningful constitutional analysis. That's part of what we have to restore.
But this book isn't really about convincing senators and congressmen that they have the ability to defend these rules. What you're doing that's interesting is you're trying to have an adult conversation with the American people And what I find interesting about this book is that it's the most non-political book I've ever read.
I wrote it intentionally that way. I wanted it to be politically ecumenical in the sense that, for the most part, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, these are principles that are neither Republican or Democratic. They're not necessarily liberal or conservative. They're just American principles that talk about protecting the American people against the excessive accumulation of power.
And a lot of young people are asking, why should I care about these old rules that these old dead white guys some 200 plus years ago wrote about? And you try to translate those values, equal treatment under the law, respect for our privacy, into things that we as Americans should care about.
Yeah, that's right. So, look, over time, our economy changes, our technology changes, our fashion trends change, our demographics in the country change. Human nature, the Constitution is all about taking into account human nature and transcending time through a document that protects people throughout all times by guarding against the excessive accumulation of power. We know what people do when they get too much power, and the Constitution takes that into account. To the extent we follow it, it protects us.
One of the most interesting stories that I wasn't that fluent on is the question of Benjamin Franklin and how he rescued the Constitutional Convention. I've always argued that, if George Washington was a leader and Sam Adams was a community organizer and Thomas Jefferson was the philosopher of our founding movement, Ben Franklin was kind of the Yoda. And you don't necessarily call him Yoda, but you suggest that he is the glue that pulled together all of these disparate interests and all of the fighting factions that ultimately led to the Constitution. Talk about that a little bit.
I actually wish I had referred to him as Yoda. It could have made for a nice merchandising opportunity.
You can steal that next
Cross promotion. Yeah, next time I'll have to remember that with the next publication of it or the sequel. Yeah, he did save it. So there was this big, fairly well-known conflict at the Constitutional Convention between the big states and the small states. The big states wanted to make sure that their population was reflected in Congress. And the small states said, yeah, but we're equally sovereign, and we don't want our votes swallowed up by the more populated states. Even after they reached the compromise that said, okay, we're going to have two houses of Congress. We'll have a Senate where the states are represented equally and a House of Representatives where they'll be represented according to population. Even after that happened, they were still deadlocked. They still couldn't get to an agreement until Benjamin Franklin came up with this great idea. And he said, okay, to sweeten the deal, let's make clear that any bill for raising revenue, any bill that includes new taxes, has to start in the House of Representatives. That's what saved it. And I tell the story of that in this book and explain why that's so important and why we need to follow it today. I also point out that we're not following it today like we should be.
Yeah, and the origination clause, the idea that tax bills should originate in the House of Representatives closer to the people, is particularly relevant today as we struggle with the destructive problems created by Obamacare. Explain why we should care about Benjamin Franklin and that genius decision that he had back then relative to what we're going through today.
We should care about the origination clause because it protects us. And when we don't follow it, it doesn't protect us. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, is a case in point. When what became Obamacare started, it originated in one very technical sense in the House. But that bill had nothing to do with health care. Had nothing to do with what became Obamacare. It had to do with certain benefits, housing-related benefits that would follow members of the armed services. It was passed in the House and came over to the Senate. Harry Reid, then the majority leader, adopted a strip and replace amendment that replaced that bill with what became Obamacare. So all the Obamacare tax provisions, these new revenue provisions, were added for the first time in the Senate rather than in the House. Had we been following the origination clause, and had we had members of Congress who were willing to say, no, we're not going to go along with that because that's originating new tax laws in the Senate, contrary to the Constitution, we would have been protected from Obamacare.
You talk a lot about the Fourth Amendment, one of my favorite amendments to the Constitution. The rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall be issued but upon probable cause. Does that still matter in the internet age when the government can find out anything about us?
It still matters, and in fact, it matters more now than ever. As I explained in the book, the modern technology that we have makes government more efficient, and it therefore can make government even more dangerous in spying on us, in lying to us, in manipulating its vast powers to our detriment and to its own advantage. And that's why I draw upon this story, this great story from John Wilkes, the English parliamentarian in the late 1700s, who was himself subjected to an unreasonable search through the use of a general warrant issued by the administration of King George III. John Wilkes fought back against that. He fought his charges in court. He eventually won his freedom. And these charges were brought in response to his publication of something called the North Briton. North Briton number 45 contained some harsh criticism of the king, and it was on that basis they arrested him, and they searched for anything that might serve as evidence to his alleged crime. But because of North Briton number 45, and because John Wilkes became such a folk hero across Britain as a result of his fight for freedom, the number 45 became synonymous with John Wilkes and also with the cause of freedom on both sides of the Atlantic. This in turn led to some of the language that we now have in the Fourth Amendment, requiring that the government get a search warrant when it wants to search, and that it state its provisions with particularity, that it state what it's going after with a sufficient degree of particularity so that you know what's lawful to be searched under it.
And yet you argue that today, under the Obama administration, certainly not starting with President Obama, the NSA violates that right to privacy.
Yes.
Explain that.
Yes. So right now the NSA collects cell phone data regarding your cell phone usage going back 5 years. It knows who you have called, who has called you, when the call was made, and how long it lasted. They know that for today, yesterday, the day before, and every day going back at least 5 years. Now, from that, they can discern an enormous amount of information about you. There are graduate researchers who, using their own models, have concluded that using data like that, they can figure out what your political affiliation is, how liberal or conservative, how politically active you are, how religiously active you are, what your religious views are, your health conditions, what medications you might take, an enormous amount of information just by studying your cell phone calling patterns. And yet all of this data is collected through the use of something that I think can at least be analogized to a general warrant. These warrants saying, we hand it over to us. That's not right. It makes the American people understandably, justifiably uncomfortable, and we need to end this practice.
There's this tension because of the internet and social media, and in one sense, it's this radically liberalizing force that gives people more freedom and more information and ability to connect with each other. But it also is this tool for a government not constrained by constitutional principles to abuse power. And that's really what the rules of the game come down to. That's what the Constitution's all about, is power is dangerous. You need to keep it in check.
That's exactly right. And consequently, when we have technology that will make it that much easier for the government to amass more power and to abuse that power, we've got to be ever more vigilant about reinforcing and enforcing our constitutional protections. I refer in the book to the Frank Church report issued back in the 1970s. They reviewed abuse of a technology that was then still somewhat new, or had been around only for a few decades. Abuse of wiretapping technology. The Church report concluded, among other things, that every presidential administration, from FDR through Nixon, had used our nation's intelligence gathering apparatus to engage in political espionage. Now, this tells me that we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. It's not something that ends well. A new technology comes along, it's abused, and until we put in place laws that strongly discourage and restrict the government's ability to abuse.
One of the interesting trends that's going on in the U.S. Senate today is exemplified by your partnership with Senator Patrick Leahy, perhaps one of the most liberal senators from the state of Vermont. He is your chief co-sponsor on legislation you've authored called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. There's a civil libertarian streak running through both political parties now. You have Tea Partiers working with progressives. What's it like to work with someone like Patrick Leahy, and tell me why you think you can get this fixed?
Well, yeah, I refer in the book to a couple of bills that I'm running with Pat Leahy. You know, he's a liberal Democrat from Vermont, and I'm not. But we both agree that there are limits on what the government can do. We both agree that the Fourth Amendment has meaning. That particular law, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act amendments, is one that gets at a problem that's been around since 1986, but that isn't known to most people. The original Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 actually purports to give the government the power to read your email. Not just to find out that you sent an email, but to read your email without a warrant as long as that email is at least 180 days old. Now that makes no sense. Maybe somebody thought it made sense in 1986. Very few people had email in 1986. Those who did had no reason to keep email for more than just a few days, and then they would delete them because they didn't have storage capacity to store them beyond that. There was no such thing as cloud computing like what we have today. And so that's why Senator Leahy and I have run this bill and other bills that are designed to protect the Fourth Amendment. Again, these are principles that are neither Republican nor Democratic. They're neither liberal nor conservative. They're simply American principles. And they're things that people from a broad spectrum of political belief in America support.
For all of the narrative about hyper-partisanship in Washington, I see this happening on other things. You've also drafted the Smarter Sentencing Act that deals with the over-federalization of our criminal justice system, and Patrick Leahy's part of that, but a number of other liberal senators. But Ted Cruz joins you, Rand Paul joins you as well. I do think that there's a trend towards understanding, getting back to these American principles that have to do with limiting power. What's your experience on criminal justice?
Yeah, my experience in the criminal justice arena has been great. You know, my lead co-sponsor with the Smarter Sentencing Act is Dick Durbin. And there again, I mean, he's a liberal Democrat from Illinois, and I'm not. Yeah. But we've got guys like Dick Durbin and Pat Leahy, Cory Booker, and others who are willing to join in this effort. We recognize something that I explain in the book, which is that when we follow the Constitution's directive on federalism, the idea that, you know, not every power is given to the federal government. And in fact, the default is supposed to be that most of the power remains close to the people at the state and local level. When we follow this, more Americans actually get more of what they want out of government and less of what they don't want in government. And this does create some great alliances among people at opposite ends of the political spectrum when they realize that everybody can get more of the kind of government they want if we just respect the Constitution. But for reasons I explain in the book, we've neglected the principle of federalism by assuming that there's nothing Congress can't do. It's wrong, and that needs to change. And fortunately, there is some bipartisan support to start to roll that back.
It's encouraging to see that across the partisan spectrum. And I think that has everything to do with the upside of the internet. I still think that young people aren't learning about the Constitution in grade school, high school, probably not law school either.
Definitely not law school.
And I suspect that's why you wrote this book, because this is an engaging story about why the rules matter. We always talk about the rule of law, but I suspect particularly young people don't understand what we talk about when we talk about the Constitution.
Yeah, that's right. I made the comment about definitely not law school somewhat facetiously. Law schools do focus on constitutional law. Sometimes I think in the law school experience there's not enough attention given to the text itself, to the words of the document itself, and to the stories underlying each provision of the Constitution. That's why I wrote this book, because when people focus on the words in the Constitution and where they came from, how we got those words, it comes to life and it becomes relevant. And it's not just something that was written by a bunch of long since dead white guys back in the late 1700s. It becomes real, it becomes tangible, it becomes concrete for today.
And that's sort of your challenge with this book. Let me ask you the obvious question. Why did you write this book? What do you want to accomplish?
I want to make the U.S. Constitution and the stories underlying it come to life for the American people. And I want the Constitution to become part of our national political discourse. We need to reinsert it into our national political discourse, as it was at the time of the founding, as it has been throughout most of our history. George Washington famously said shortly after the Constitution was drafted, but before it had been ratified, that the power would always remain in the people to protect the Constitution. That from time to time they would see that it was being interpreted and implemented in a manner not consistent with their liking, and that whenever that did happen, the people could and undoubtedly would choose to recall those representatives that they had elected and replace them with someone else. That can't happen. It certainly can't happen effectively and regularly as it needs to unless people don't understand the document. And that won't happen unless they know the stories behind it. That's where this book comes into play.
And that's ultimately your call to action, going back to your experience as a kid. You want people to sit down at the dining room table, to sit down with neighbors, and to talk about the rules of the game, to talk about the Constitution, the roadmap that makes America a great place. You're putting the burden back on their shoulders, just like George Washington did.
Yes, exactly. And that's to offset this trend that we referenced briefly earlier, whereby the tyranny of expertise has crept into our political culture. We have assumed for too long that the Constitution is a court thing. It's a thing for the courts. It's a thing for the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court says about the Constitution is the beginning and the end of constitutional analysis. Therefore, there's not really much ownership by American politicians of the Constitution. They can always just punt it to the courts and say, we'll let them figure out whether or not it's constitutional. That's wrong. When individual senators and congressmen have all taken an oath to uphold and protect and defend this Constitution, that means they're required to engage in their own analysis.
It's interesting to see it almost as a political football. No one wants to stand up for these principles. But again, isn't it the role of you and I and everyone watching this program to defend these principles, to understand what they are, and to show up? That's the ethos of the modern American political system.
That's right. We all have to own it and protect it and defend it. And look, everybody's entitled to their own opinion about it. Not everyone will always come to the same conclusion that you will or that I might in reading a particular provision of the Constitution. But they do need to read it, and they do need to understand it and understand where it came from. So this book is designed more than anything else to start the discussion, to facilitate a discussion about language in the Constitution that's been neglected, why it's important, why it matters, and where we go from here in restoring it.
So this book was released recently. When did the book come out?
It came out April 7th, and it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other places where books are sold.
I have to say it was the most readable. I'm not a lawyer, and I should mention that.
You say that proudly.
Yeah, just to clear my conscience. It's a very readable set of stories about why these old principles apply today. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to thank you for writing this book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Book TV is on Twitter and Facebook, and we want to hear from you. Tweet us, twitter.com/BookTV,